In this lecture, we're going to discuss a phenomenon that occurred in the Americas after the arrival of Europeans, known as the Columbian Exchange. Typically, when we talk about the arrival of Columbus in the Americas, we think about the gradual colonization of Americas. We think about the beginnings of European colonization and exploitation of the Americas. But there's an additional component that's not frequently discussed when considering the after effects of the arrival of Columbus and the Spaniards. If we look at the world as a series of continents that have some connections between each other, you can see that Europe, Asia, and Africa, and to a lesser extent Australia, have some significant geographical connections whereby it's relatively easy to get from one part of the continent to the other. We refer to this region as the Old World because this is the world that was sort of known to those who lived in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Contrast that with the Americas, which developed in relative isolation. We can see North and South America, a very great distance between these continents and the continent of Europe to the east, and traveling west from the Americas, Asia, many thousands of miles. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they had considerable biological advantages. Immunity to a significant number of diseases that had never emerged in the Americas. In particular, smallpox was an especially deadly biological agent to Native American peoples. Europeans, of course, to Europeans it was a serious disease with mortality rates in the 10 to 20% range when epidemic waves would hit. But to Native Americans, the death toll, or the rate of disease in terms of mortality, the mortality rate would be as high as 50%. In this particular image, which is an artist's rendition, an Aztec artist's rendition of the progression of smallpox, we believe, in this particular individual, you can see how the individual quickly succumbs to the disease. In terms of biology, we can get immunity a lot of different ways. Here are some of the methods by which immunity can be obtained. Transplacental, from the mother. You can vaccinate yourself. Of course, this is a more modern medical technique that didn't begin to emerge in the West until the late 18th century. If you have a disease that doesn't kill you, your body can produce antibodies. There is also some interesting research into what is known as innate immunity or inherited immunity, in that we seem to, through our DNA, possess at least some knowledge through repeated generations of exposure to a disease. One interesting side discussion regarding genetic immunity is related to sickle cell anemia, which is a condition that is not it's a chronic and sometimes deadly condition for those who have it. But there's some interesting research that suggests that people who have had sickle cell anemia have greater immunity to malaria, and that perhaps through natural selection, those with this particular genetic trait, which is prominently found in malarial zones like West Africa and the southern Mediterranean regions. The net result for Native American groups is rapid decline in the population. On this particular chart, I've put an estimate of the number of people in the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus. This is sort of a middle ground on the estimate of the number of people in the Americas in the late 15th century. Groups known as the high counters, that's what the term is that refers to them, suggest perhaps as many as 150 to 200 million people in the Americas. The low counters suggest in the 20 to 30 million range. So this is kind of a medium number, but both the high counters and the low counters, in terms of their estimates, are pretty much in agreement that within a century to a century and a half after contact with Europeans, Native American populations fell precipitously, as much as 90%. However, the toll from epidemics is much greater than simply the initial wave of death. When those who care for the sick become ill or die, then whatever healthcare system exists falls apart. As farmers and pastoralists die off, food becomes scarce, so there's famines that typically follow many serious epidemics. Families fall apart, social structures fall apart, and in terms of religion, if your religious tradition has served you well for a long period of time, and then in this time of sickness and death, it doesn't seem to serve you, many times in human history when epidemics have struck, people's faith begins to waver, and they either give up their faith or perhaps find a new faith system, and that has happened many times in human history. In this particular slide, this depiction shows in one image some of the effects of an epidemic that struck this Abenaki community. The Abenaki were a New England Native American group. So you see on the very bottom the sick and dying, and then toward the top you see people who appear to be distraught, that their lives have been forever disrupted and changed because of this epidemic. So kind of in one image encapsulates the death and destruction, as well as the social changes that occur after a particular epidemic hits. In terms of the exchange itself, the Columbian Exchange, this was not a one-way transmission of life forms. It went two ways. So from Eurasia or Eurasia and Africa, a number of life forms found their way to the Americas. Rats were particularly problematic for Native American groups, many of whom stored food underground, and the arrival of rats meant famine and food shortages. Pardon my dogs barking in the background here. A number of domesticated animals came over to the Americas from Europe, which had significant changes on social structures, particularly horses, which led some previously sedentary groups to become more nomadic, especially in the Great Plains region of the United States. From the New World, of the Americas, to the Old World, a number of products were distributed or found their way across the Atlantic. Maize, which is referred to in the United States as corn, is one of the most significant of these products. You can see the only significant animal forms that found their way to Europe and Asia were llamas and guinea pigs. Tobacco was an important crop that the Europeans began to develop a taste for in the 17th century. There's something of a controversy regarding the sexually transmitted disease syphilis and the Columbian Exchange that I'll briefly mention. Some folks like to look at the fact that syphilis arrived in Europe in 1493 and 1494, a particularly virulent form of syphilis, and it's tempting to connect this to the Columbian Exchange. The timing, of course, would be convenient in terms of Columbus and his sailors returning to the Americas. However, biologically and epidemiologically, we can't say that with certainty. It is possible that syphilis emerged, or this particularly virulent form of syphilis emerged on its own, and it's just coincidental. So we're not quite sure, but the timing does suggest that it is possible that it transmitted from the Americas back to Europe. Finally, scientists and historians continue to debate, again, pardon my dogs barking, continue to debate the meaning of the Columbian Exchange and the death toll that these epidemic diseases took on Native Americans. Some suggest because Europeans seem to have some awareness that they were not suffering to the extent of Native Americans, that this is a form of biological warfare or genocide. Personally, I tend toward the more scientific explanation that this was coincidental, that Native American groups, regardless of their history, would have eventually succumbed to many of these diseases. But there's a lively debate regarding this. And this draws to a close our discussion of the Columbian Exchange.